My son said. My wife needs peace. We can't have you around anymore. I didn't protest. He had no idea what he was about to lose. Before you scroll away, before you decide this sounds too harsh to be real, stay with me until the end and tell me in the comments which city you're listening from, because this isn't just my story. It's one that unfolds quietly, in a lot of families when comfort becomes more important than conscience. He said it calmly, almost gently, standing a few feet away from me, like he was delivering news he believed was reasonable, not cruel, and for a moment I didn't respond at all. Not because I was shocked, but because something in his tone told me the decision had already been made somewhere without me. I was in his house that afternoon, sitting at the edge of the dining table, my coat folded neatly over the chair, the kind of small courtesy you keep when you're trying not to take up space. And when he finished speaking, he looked at me expectantly, waiting for an argument, waiting for tears, waiting for resistance, but I didn't give him any of that. I simply nodded, slowly, the way you do when you've just been handed a truth you didn't ask for, but suddenly understand. And I said, I see, not loudly, not bitterly, just enough to let him know I'd heard him. And that was when his expression changed, confusion flickering across his face, because he'd prepared himself for conflict, not acceptance. He'd rehearsed explanations about boundaries, about stress, about how his wife had been overwhelmed, but my silence disrupted all of that. I stood up, picked up my coat, and thanked him for being honest. And if you're listening right now and wondering why I didn't fight back, why I didn't remind him of everything I'd done for him, it's because I realized something in that moment. Arguing would have kept me in a role he was already assigning me. The problem, the obstacle, the source of tension. And I refused to play it. He walked me to the door, still talking, still justifying, saying things like, "It's not permanent," and "This doesn't change how much we love you." Phrases people use when they're trying to soften a cut they don't want to take responsibility for. And I smiled at him then, a small, polite smile, the kind that ends conversations without reopening them. Because what he didn't know, what he couldn't have known watching me leave so quietly, was that my absence wasn't going to bring them peace. It was going to expose exactly how much of their stability had rested on something they'd just pushed away. And if you stay with me, you'll understand why not protesting was the most powerful decision I made that day. On the drive home that evening, I replayed his words over and over, not because I didn't understand them, but because I was trying to locate the moment they stopped being unthinkable and started being inevitable. And if you're still listening to me right now, stay. Because this didn't begin with that sentence at his dining table. It began years earlier in ways that felt harmless at the time. My life before that conversation was quiet, not lonely, quiet in the way people earn after decades of responsibility. I lived alone, paid my own bills, kept my routines, volunteered twice a week, cooked for myself, drove myself, made my own appointments. Nothing dramatic, nothing fragile. I wasn't asking to be taken care of. I was simply present in my son's life in the way I thought mothers were allowed to be. Occasional visits, phone calls, holidays, the usual rhythm, and for a long time I believed we had a good relationship. Not perfect, but respectful. He'd ask how I was doing. I'd ask about work, about his wife, about their plans. And when small tensions surfaced, I explained them away, telling myself this was what adulthood looked like, distance layered with politeness. But looking back now, I can see the subtle shifts I ignored, the way conversations shortened when his wife was around, the way invitations became conditional, phrased carefully. "It might be a lot right now. She's just overwhelmed. We'll figure something out later." Language that placed me on the edge without openly pushing me away, and I accepted it. Because I didn't want to be the mother who demanded space she wasn't welcome in. I didn't want to be seen as intrusive. And if you're listening right now and that sounds familiar, understand this. Many people confuse self-erasure with respect, and I was very good at erasing myself quietly. I told myself I was being considerate, that I was helping by not asking for much, that my presence should never feel like a burden. and over time, that belief hardened into something dangerous. It trained them to think my absence was neutral, manageable, even preferable. My son would mention how stressed his wife was, how she needed calm, how she struggled with noise, opinions, emotional weight, and I listened, sympathetically, nodding, offering reassurance, never once imagining that I would eventually be categorized alongside those stressors, never realizing that peace, when defined narrowly enough, can start to mean elimination. There were moments I should have paid attention to, small ones, like the time I offered to help during a difficult week and was told it would throw off the balance, or when I suggested stopping by and was told it wasn't a good time for energy shifts, phrases that sounded thoughtful but left me feeling oddly misplaced. And instead of questioning them, I adjusted, always adjusting, shrinking my footprint until my role became almost ceremonial, welcome only when convenient, invisible when not. And that's the thing no one tells you. Once you accept being optional, it doesn't take long before someone decides you're expendable. My son didn't wake up one day and decide I was a problem. He arrived at that conclusion slowly, supported by years of my compliance, and that realization hurt more than his words ever could, because it meant I had participated in building the version of me he felt comfortable discarding. And if you're listening right now and feeling a knot in your chest, stay with me, because this isn't about blame, it's about awareness. I trusted that love would protect me from being treated like an inconvenience. I trusted that being undemanding would keep me safe. But trust without boundaries is just access, and access, once normalized, becomes entitlement. By the time he told me his wife needed peace, and they couldn't have me around anymore, he wasn't being impulsive. He was acting on a narrative that had been forming quietly for years, a narrative where my role was undefined. My needs were minimal, and my removal could be framed as reasonable. And what unsettled me most as I pulled into my driveway that night wasn't anger. It was clarity, the understanding that this wasn't a misunderstanding I could fix by explaining myself better. It was a conclusion they had reached together, and the calm certainty in his voice came from believing I would accept it the way I'd accepted everything else, without protest, without consequence. I sat in my car for a long time before going inside, listening to the engine tick as it cooled, realizing how close I'd come to internalizing his decision as truth, to believing that peace for them required my absence, and that maybe that was just the cost of being a mother who didn't want to cause trouble. But something in me resisted that framing, not loudly, not defiantly, but firmly, because I understood that if I accepted this without reflection, without reassessment, I wouldn't just lose access to my son. I would lose the right to define my own place in the world. And if you stay with me, you'll see how that quiet drive home became the moment I stopped trying to fit into the space they allowed me and started paying attention to what was being taken from me instead. The weeks after that conversation didn't bring silence the way I expected. They brought clarity, the kind that only arrives once you stop chasing reassurance. And if you're still listening to me right now, stay, because this was when I began to see the pattern I'd spent years explaining away. It started with small exclusions that no one announced out loud. A family dinner I found out about after the fact. A weekend gathering mentioned casually in passing. A holiday plan that changed without anyone thinking to tell me, and each time I noticed, I told myself it was coincidence, that I was reading too much into it, that people are busy and things slip, but patterns don't slip, they form. And once I stopped trying to insert myself politely back into the picture revealed itself. My son stopped calling as often, not abruptly, but gradually. Conversations shortened, updates became vague. And when I asked questions, they were answered with summaries instead of details, the kind you give someone you don't expect to follow up. His wife's presence hovered over everything, not overtly hostile, just selectively absent. My messages went unanswered for hours, then days, and when replies came, they were courteous but closed, like doors gently but firmly shut. And if you're listening right now and wondering why I didn't confront them, why I didn't demand clarity, It's because confrontation only works when the other person is willing to acknowledge your place, and I could feel mine dissolving. I began noticing how often decisions were framed as already made. We decided. It works better this way. This is what's healthiest for us. Language that didn't invite discussion, only compliance. And I complied, not because I agreed, but because I was still hoping restraint would earn me reconsideration. I was wrong. Restraint doesn't earn respect. It teaches people what they can remove without consequence. There was a moment that crystallized it for me. A mutual acquaintance mentioned seeing my son and his wife at an event I'd always been invited to before, not maliciously, just conversationally. And when I asked my son about it later, he paused, then said, "We didn't think you'd be comfortable. Not. We forgot. Not. We should have told you. But we decided for you," and something inside me settled. Because that sentence contained everything: the assumption, the authority, the quiet dismissal of my agency. And if you're listening right now, and that sentence sounds familiar, understand this. Once people start deciding your comfort for you, they've already decided your relevance. I stopped offering explanations after that, stopped justifying my presence, stopped adjusting my schedule to accommodate theirs, and in that stillness, more became visible. My son would mention how much calmer things were lately, how his wife was doing better, how their home felt lighter, and each comment landed like a confirmation. My absence wasn't a loss to them, it was a solution. And realizing that didn't make me angry, it made me precise. Because precision removes illusion, I saw how often my role had been to absorb tension, to listen without responding, to smooth over discomfort simply by existing quietly, and when that role was removed, they didn't miss me. They missed the function I served. And that distinction matters, because people don't mourn what they never truly see. They only notice when something stops working the way it used to. My son didn't ask how I was doing during that time. Not really. He asked whether I was okay with arrangements, whether I understood boundaries, whether I respected their needs, questions framed as care but centered entirely on compliance, and I answered them honestly, briefly, without emotion. And that seemed to unsettle him more than any argument would have. Because neutrality doesn't feed justification. I wasn't begging to be included, and I wasn't protesting my exclusion. I was simply observing it, and that observation changed the dynamic. Because it meant I was no longer negotiating my place, I was assessing whether it still existed at all. There were moments of doubt, of course, late nights when I wondered if I was being too sensitive, too rigid, too proud. But those doubts quieted every time another decision was made without me, another plan finalized in my absence, another explanation offered only after the outcome was set, and slowly, unmistakably, I understood that what was happening wasn't accidental, it was structural. My presence was now conditional, dependent on how well I fit into a version of peace that required my silence. And if you're listening right now, and feeling that recognition settle in, stay, because this was the point where I stopped asking whether they were pushing me out and started asking why they needed to, and that question would lead me somewhere they never expected, somewhere that would force them to confront what my absence actually meant, not emotionally, but practically. And once that door opened, there was no closing it again. It happened again, not shouted this time, not framed as a boundary discussion, but stated as a conclusion. And if you're still listening to me right now, stay, because this was the moment the quiet exclusions hardened into something irreversible. My son called and asked if we could talk. His voice careful, measured, the kind people use when they believe they're being reasonable. And when I arrived, his wife was already seated, hands folded, posture calm, like someone attending a meeting rather than a family conversation. There was no small talk, no easing into it. He said it almost immediately. "We need to be honest with you." And that phrase alone told me everything. Honesty delivered late is usually justification, not care. He explained that their home needed to be a place of peace, that tension, even unspoken tension, was affecting his wife's well-being, that they'd been trying to manage it quietly, but it wasn't sustainable. And then he said it again, slower this time, as if repetition would make it kinder. "We can't have you around anymore." "Not permanently," he added quickly. "Just for now, until things felt more balanced, until they could breathe." Language designed to sound temporary while functioning as a removal. And I noticed how his wife didn't look at me while he spoke. Her gaze fixed somewhere over my shoulder, like I wasn't part of the exchange at all, and that absence of acknowledgement carried more weight than his words, because it confirmed that this decision wasn't a compromise, it was a verdict. He waited after saying it, eyes searching my face, bracing for the reaction he'd prepared for, and when I didn't give it to him, when I simply nodded again, the room shifted. He stumbled through additional explanations, assurances that this wasn't about love, that they cared deeply, that this was necessary for healing. But none of that landed, because once someone tells you your presence disrupts their peace, the relationship has already changed. Arguing doesn't restore it, and if you're listening right now and wondering what it feels like to be dismissed so calmly, it feels surreal, like watching someone reorganize your life while explaining how much they value you. I asked one question, quietly, "Is this what you want, or what you've decided is best?" And he hesitated, just long enough to tell the truth without speaking it, because decisions framed as best are usually wants that don't want to be owned. His wife finally spoke then, her voice soft, controlled. "We need space," she said. "Not I need, but we." Collective language that shields responsibility. And in that moment, I understood that the conversation wasn't happening to reach understanding. It was happening to secure compliance, my compliance. And I gave it, not because I agreed, but because I saw the cost of resisting. Resistance would have been labeled disruption, emotional instability, further proof that I didn't respect their boundaries. And I refused to hand them that narrative. I thanked them for telling me directly, gathered my things, and stood up, and the relief on their faces was immediate, unguarded, as if they hadn't realized how much they'd been holding their breath. And that relief told me everything I needed to know. My departure wasn't painful for them, it was a release, and that realization settled heavily as I walked out, because it meant this wasn't about managing conflict, it was about removing a variable. And variables don't get consulted, they get eliminated. My son followed me to the door, repeating that this wasn't rejection, that they'd reach out when things stabilized, that I should understand how hard this had been for them. And I listened without responding, because explanations offered after exclusion are rarely meant to comfort the person leaving, they're meant to absolve the people staying. I drove home in silence, not replaying the conversation this time, but analyzing it, noticing what wasn't said. No timeline, no conditions for return, no acknowledgement of what was being taken from me, just an assumption that I would accept absence as love. And that assumption clarified everything, because it revealed how little my agency factored into their vision of peace. They didn't ask whether I wanted space, they decided I needed to provide it. They didn't negotiate terms, they announced outcomes. And if you're listening right now and feeling that click of recognition, stay, because this wasn't the end of the story. It was the point where their certainty began to work against them, because when people remove you without understanding your role, they often discover too late that they've also removed something they depended on. And as I pulled into my driveway that night, the house quiet around me, I realized that by accepting their decision without protest, I'd done something they didn't anticipate. I'd taken my power with me, and they wouldn't notice it was gone until they needed it most. Once I was no longer part of their daily orbit, the word peace started appearing everywhere. And if you're still listening to me right now, stay, because this was when that word began to unravel. My son used it often when we spoke briefly on the phone, always in the same careful tone. Things are calmer now. She's finally able to breathe. The house feels lighter, and each time he said it, I noticed what he didn't mention. No improvement in communication, no closeness restored, no sense of stability beyond the absence of my presence. Peace, it turned out, wasn't something they were building. It was something they were subtracting, and subtraction is easy. When you decide the removed piece won't be missed, I started paying attention to what that peace actually required. Fewer visits, fewer questions, fewer reminders of anything that existed before his marriage, fewer voices that might challenge decisions already made, and slowly, the shape of it became clear. Peace wasn't about quiet. It was about control. His wife preferred an environment where nothing complicated surfaced unexpectedly, where emotional labor was predictable and contained, where narratives stayed consistent, and my presence, even silent, disrupted that, not because I caused conflict, but because I represented continuity, history, comparison, the parts of him that existed before her. And if you're listening right now, and wondering how I know this, it's because once you're pushed far enough away, you begin to see the structure instead of the emotion. I noticed how decisions accelerated after my removal, changes to routines, finances, social circles, all happening quickly, efficiently, without consultation. And that efficiency came at a cost. My son sounded more tired than before, not relieved, just busier. His wife's calm seemed fragile, dependent on nothing deviating from plan, and I recognized that pattern immediately. Peace that requires constant enforcement isn't peace, it's suppression. There were small tells, comments he made without realizing what they revealed, frustrations about how much responsibility he carried now, how there was no one else to help with certain things, how managing everything alone was harder than he'd expected, and each time, he'd stop himself, as if remembering he wasn't supposed to need me anymore. And if you're listening right now, stay, because this is where the story shifts. I wasn't angry hearing these things. I was attentive, because what they called peace was already cracking, not because I was gone, but because my absence had removed a stabilizing force they hadn't acknowledged. I'd been the buffer, the quiet presence who absorbed tension without amplifying it, the person who noticed small changes before they became problems, the one who remembered details others overlooked, and without that, the system they'd built began stressing itself. I saw it in the way his wife's needs expanded, rather than settled. New sensitivities, new boundaries, new conditions for calm. And I understood then that peace defined by exclusion is never satisfied. It always asks for one more removal, one more adjustment, one more silence, and eventually, there's nothing left to remove but the people enforcing it. My son didn't connect these dots yet. He still believed the story he'd told himself, that pushing me away had solved something. That discomfort came from outside, not from imbalance within, but I could hear the strain in his voice, the subtle defensiveness when he spoke about his marriage, the way he justified decisions that didn't need defending if they were truly right. And if you're listening right now and recognizing that pattern in your own life, understand this. When someone tells you their peace depends on your absence, what they're really saying is that they don't want to manage complexity. They want simplicity, and simplicity often comes at someone else's expense. I didn't confront them about this. I didn't point out the cracks. I didn't offer unsolicited insight, because insight offered too early gets dismissed as interference. Instead, I stayed quiet, observant, letting the consequences of their choices reveal themselves naturally. And in that quiet, I began to understand something else, something they hadn't considered at all. My removal didn't just change the emotional landscape, it altered practical realities they'd taken for granted. Support structures, contingencies, unspoken agreements, and they wouldn't notice those losses immediately, because systems don't fail all at once, they fail under pressure. And pressure was coming, not dramatically, not catastrophically, but inevitably. And if you stay with me, you'll see how what they called peace began demanding payments they weren't prepared to make, payments that couldn't be deferred, negotiated, or explained away. Because once you build a life on the assumption that certain people will always absorb the cost, removing them doesn't eliminate the cost. It just changes who has to pay it. And that realization, when it finally reached them, would come too late to undo what they'd already set in motion. There were things they never asked about when they decided I shouldn't be around anymore. And if you're still listening to me right now, stay, because this was where the balance began to shift without anyone announcing it. My son and his wife believed my role in their lives was emotional, optional, easily removed. What they didn't realize was how much of what they relied on wasn't emotional at all. It was structural, quiet, and invisible precisely because it had always worked. I had been the one who knew where documents were kept, who remembered deadlines that weren't written down, who noticed when patterns changed before they became problems, not because I interfered, but because I paid attention. And once I stepped out of their orbit, those things didn't disappear. They were simply left unattended. I didn't withdraw support dramatically. I didn't announce boundaries or issue warnings. I just stopped compensating, stopped smoothing, stopped catching what fell through the cracks. And if you're listening right now and wondering whether that was intentional, it was necessary, because continuing to carry responsibilities no one acknowledged would have kept the illusion alive. My son began calling with questions that sounded casual but weren't, asking if I remembered where certain paperwork was, if I'd ever dealt with a particular issue before, if I knew who to contact about something he'd assumed handled itself. And each time, I answered honestly, briefly, without inserting myself back into the system. I told him what I knew, but I didn't manage the outcome, and that distinction mattered more than he understood, because for the first time, he had to follow through himself, make decisions without a safety net he hadn't realized was there. His wife noticed it too, though she didn't name it directly. I could hear it in the way she framed questions, carefully, indirectly, as if testing whether I was still available, without admitting she needed me. And I remained polite, distant, consistent, because consistency teaches faster than confrontation ever could. The truth was, there were legal and financial realities they'd never paid attention to because they'd never had to. Arrangements that existed quietly in the background. Contingencies put in place years ago when my husband was alive. Systems that assumed communication, cooperation, shared awareness. And, when those assumptions were broken, the systems didn't fail immediately. They simply became rigid, inflexible, no longer adjusting to their needs automatically. I'd updated certain things after the conversation where they told me I wasn't welcome, not out of spite, but out of clarity. Access that had existed informally was formalized, permissions were tightened, decision-making authority was clarified, not announced, just recorded, because when people show you they're comfortable excluding you from their lives, you have a responsibility to protect what still belongs to you. And if you're listening right now, understand this. Quiet preparation isn't revenge. It's survival. My son didn't notice these changes at first, because people rarely notice systems until they stop bending for them. But eventually, he felt it, delays that hadn't existed before, processes that now required his direct involvement, responsibilities that could no longer be deferred or outsourced. And with that came frustration. Not directed at me, but at the friction itself. Friction he'd never experienced before. He complained once, half joking, that everything felt harder lately, that nothing seemed as straightforward. And I listened, because that complaint told me everything. The ease he'd enjoyed had been built on contributions he'd dismissed as irrelevant. And now that ease was gone, not because I'd taken something away, but because I'd stopped providing what was never recognized as support in the first place. There was a moment that clarified it completely. He asked me if I could just handle something like before. And when I didn't immediately agree, when I asked him to walk me through what he'd already done, he went quiet, not angry, just surprised, as if the expectation itself had finally surfaced. And in that pause, I realized he'd never considered the possibility that my availability wasn't guaranteed, that my competence wasn't communal property, and that realization unsettled him more than my absence ever had. His wife grew sharper during that period, more controlling, more precise, as if tightening her grip could recreate the calm she believed she'd secured. But control doesn't replace competence, it only masks its absence temporarily, and the more she tried to manage everything, the more strained their environment became. Peace started requiring enforcement, reminders, corrections, and constant vigilance. And if you're listening right now, stay, because this is where the illusion begins to collapse. The peace they'd chosen wasn't sustainable without the very presence they'd removed. Not because I was indispensable as a person, but because I'd been part of a system they never bothered to understand. And systems don't tolerate denial for long. They either adapt or expose what's missing. I didn't celebrate this shift. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt resolved, because I knew something they didn't yet, that once people experience the full weight of what they've taken for granted, they don't respond with gratitude. They respond with blame. And that blame was coming, not as apology, but as accusation, because it's easier to believe someone withheld help than to admit you misjudged their value. And if you stay with me, you'll see how the next phase didn't arrive as reflection or regret, but as escalation, because when people realize they've lost control, they rarely look inward first. They look for something to reclaim, and I had just become the obstacle they didn't expect to need back. The shift didn't announce itself as hostility. It arrived disguised as concern, and if you're still listening to me right now, stay, because this was when I realized they weren't uncomfortable with losing my presence. They were uncomfortable with losing access. My son's tone changed first, less tentative, more directive. His questions stopped sounding like requests and started sounding like expectations, framed carefully, politely, but carrying an edge I hadn't heard before. He'd say things like, "We need to figure this out," or, "This would be easier if you just helped like before." Language that assumed a shared responsibility I'd never agreed to after being dismissed. And when I didn't respond the way he expected, when I didn't immediately reinsert myself into the machinery he'd taken for granted, his frustrations surfaced in small, involuntary ways. Longer silences on the phone, sharper exhalations, explanations that felt rehearsed rather than honest. His wife escalated differently, not openly confrontational, but strategic. She reached out under the guise of reconciliation, messages about wanting harmony, about how family should come together, about how misunderstandings happen when emotions run high. And if you're listening right now and that sounds generous, understand this. Generosity that only appears when someone needs something isn't generosity at all. It's negotiation. She suggested meeting somewhere neutral, coffee, lunch, just to clear the air. And I declined politely, not because I was afraid of the conversation, but because I recognized the pattern. Conversations framed as healing often become opportunities to reset expectations without acknowledging harm. And I wasn't willing to be folded back into a system that had already decided my worth was conditional. That refusal didn't sit well with them. My son accused me of being distant, of holding grudges, of making things harder than they needed to be. And when I pointed out that distance had been their decision, not mine, he bristled. Because accountability disrupts narratives built on self-justification. He began mentioning how others were concerned about me, how people had noticed I'd been quieter lately, how isolation wasn't healthy, subtle insinuations wrapped in care. And if you're listening right now, pay attention, because this is how escalation often begins, not with threats, but with implication, the suggestion that your boundaries are symptoms, that your autonomy is evidence of instability. I didn't argue with him. I documented everything, dates, messages, tone shifts, because when concern becomes coercion, clarity is protection. His wife's tone hardened after that. The warmth disappeared, replaced by a brittle politeness that barely concealed irritation. She accused me of refusing to cooperate, of undermining their marriage by withholding support, and that accusation landed heavily, not because it was true, but because it revealed how she viewed my role, not as a person, but as a resource. And resources that stop functioning are seen as problems, not individuals with rights. My son echoed that sentiment during one call, saying things like, "We're overwhelmed. We don't have anyone else. You know how much we relied on you." And for the first time, he said something honest without realizing it. This wasn't supposed to be this hard. And there it was, the admission beneath all the justification. They hadn't removed me because I was disruptive. They'd removed me because they thought my absence wouldn't cost them anything, and now that it did, they were scrambling to regain control, not by inviting me back as an equal, but by pressuring me to resume my role without restoring my place. And if you're listening right now and recognizing this tactic, understand this: people who escalate like this aren't seeking resolution, they're seeking leverage. The next step came quietly, but unmistakably. My son mentioned he'd spoken to someone about me, just to get advice, he said, about whether I was handling things well, about whether my withdrawal was healthy. The implication was clear. Others were being brought into a narrative I hadn't consented to, and that's when I knew the conflict had moved beyond family dynamics into something more dangerous. When private boundaries are reframed publicly as concern, the stage is being set for intervention, not conversation. I remained calm outwardly, but internally, I understood the risk. People who feel entitled to your support often feel entitled to your story as well, and rewriting it is easier than admitting they misjudged you. I consulted quietly, not dramatically, with people who understood these patterns, professionals who had seen this escalation before, and they confirmed what I already suspected. This wasn't about peace anymore. It was about restoring access through pressure, and pressure, when it fails, often turns into something more formal, more institutional, because institutions can be used to override boundaries when persuasion no longer works. And if you stay with me, you'll see how their next move didn't come as another conversation or plea, but as an attempt to involve systems designed to protect people, systems they believed they could bend to regain what they'd lost, systems that don't always behave the way people expect when the truth is documented instead of dramatized. The call didn't come from my son, and if you're still listening to me right now, stay, because this was the moment I knew they'd crossed from persuasion into procedure. The woman introduced herself calmly, professionally, said she was following up on a concern that had been raised about my well-being. Nothing accusatory, nothing dramatic, just enough official language to make it clear this wasn't a conversation I could ignore. She asked if I had time to answer a few questions, and I said yes. Not because I was intimidated, but because I understood something my son and his wife didn't. Systems don't respond to panic. They respond to information. The questions were predictable, about my routines, my support network, my ability to manage daily tasks, and I answered them plainly, without defensiveness, without embellishment, because truth doesn't need urgency to be persuasive. She asked whether I felt isolated, whether family conflict had affected my stability, whether I felt pressured to withdraw from relationships, and I answered honestly that boundaries had been set without my consent, that my withdrawal wasn't confusion, it was response, and there was a pause on the other end of the line. Not uncomfortable, just attentive, because clarity changes how questions are heard. She scheduled a visit, framed as a wellness check, and when I hung up, I didn't panic. I prepared, not theatrically, just methodically. I gathered records, calendars, notes, documentation of messages and timelines, because when concern is weaponized, preparation is not paranoia, it's protection. The visit was brief, respectful, conducted by someone who'd seen these situations before. She observed, asked, listened, and what struck me most was how quickly the narrative my son had been building began to unravel under neutral scrutiny. Claims of isolation didn't match my schedule, concerns about instability didn't align with my medical records, and suggestions that I was confused collapsed when I answered questions with consistency and detail. And if you're listening right now, understand this. Institutions aren't fooled by emotion alone. They look for patterns, and the pattern they saw wasn't neglect or decline. It was escalation from a family member frustrated by boundaries. The follow-up report reflected that, measured language noting no evidence of impairment, documenting the context of the referral, and advising that future concerns should be raised collaboratively rather than unilaterally, which was polite language for something more serious. Credibility matters, and once questioned, it doesn't automatically reset. My son didn't take that well. He called me after the visit, his voice tight, accusing me of making him look bad, of exaggerating the situation, of turning a simple check into a problem. And if you're listening right now and that reaction sounds familiar, hear this. People who misuse systems often get angry at the outcome, not the misuse. I didn't argue with him. I told him the truth, that I'd answered questions honestly, that I hadn't initiated the process, and that if he felt exposed, it was because the situation didn't support the story he'd told. His wife reacted more sharply, sending messages about betrayal, about how involving outsiders had crossed a line, irony wrapped in accusation, because it hadn't occurred to her that involving outsiders without my consent had been acceptable until those outsiders didn't agree with her framing. And that's when the shift became undeniable. The system they'd tried to leverage didn't validate their control. It limited it, notes were made, context was recorded, and while nothing punitive happened immediately, the direction of scrutiny changed, away from me and toward the motivation behind the report. And that change mattered, because once systems see a pattern of boundary override, future attempts are viewed differently, not dismissed, but examined. My son sensed that, even if he didn't fully understand it yet. His tone changed again, more cautious, less assured. He asked what I'd told them, what they'd written, whether there would be consequences, questions that revealed fear rather than concern. And I answered minimally, because at this stage, transparency didn't require explanation. The truth was already documented, and documentation doesn't need interpretation. Days passed, then weeks, and the intensity receded, not because reconciliation had occurred, but because escalation had failed. And when escalation fails, people either reflect or retreat. My son did neither fully. He hovered in uncertainty, unsure how to proceed now that authority hadn't sided with him. His wife withdrew, not from me, but from the effort itself, because control that requires constant effort isn't control, it's exhaustion. And in the quiet that followed, I felt something I hadn't expected, not relief, but steadiness, the kind that comes when a threat has been tested and found ineffective. And if you're listening right now, stay, because this wasn't the end of their attempts to reassert themselves, but it was the moment the rules changed. The moment they realized they couldn't remove me quietly, couldn't override me cleanly, couldn't rely on institutions to finish what persuasion couldn't. And once that realization settles in, people don't usually apologize. They reassess what they stand to lose, and that reassessment was already underway, quietly, imperfectly, but decisively, because systems may move slowly, but once they turn, they don't turn back easily. The consequences didn't arrive all at once, and if you're still listening to me right now, stay, because this was when the cost of what they'd done began to surface in places they hadn't anticipated. After the visit and the report, nothing dramatic happened on paper, no charges, no warnings issued aloud, but the atmosphere shifted. Conversations with extended family grew cautious, mutual acquaintances asked quieter questions, and my son began noticing that people weren't accepting his version of events as readily as before. Not because they'd chosen sides, but because inconsistencies have weight. And once introduced, they don't disappear. Someone mentioned the wellness check in passing, not accusatorily, just conversationally, and the way my son reacted told me everything. Defensiveness disguised as humor, explanations offered too quickly, reassurance no one had asked for. And if you're listening right now, understand this. When people feel their credibility slipping, they try to secure it verbally. But credibility isn't secured by repetition. It's secured by coherence, and his story no longer held together the way it once had. His wife felt it too. She became more careful in public, less outspoken, avoiding situations where questions might arise, because control works best in isolation, and once isolation breaks, the effort required to maintain appearances multiplies. I didn't correct anyone's assumptions during that time. I didn't volunteer details or seek validation, because truth doesn't need advocacy when documentation exists. And gradually, the social temperature changed. Invitations my son expected didn't arrive. Conversations he used to lead shifted around him. And it wasn't punishment, it was recalibration. People adjust their trust when information changes, often without announcing it. Professionally, the impact was subtle but real. My son mentioned increased scrutiny at work, questions about judgment, about decision-making under pressure, nothing overt. Just enough to remind him that personal conduct bleeds into professional perception, especially when authority is involved. He resented that deeply, blamed gossip, blamed misunderstandings, blamed me. And if you're listening right now and that sounds familiar, hear this. When people feel exposed, they often confuse consequences with betrayal. But consequences don't require intent, they follow action naturally. The marriage felt the strain most clearly. The peace they'd worked so hard to protect now required constant management. Conversations about money, logistics, and responsibility became frequent, tense, and unresolved. My son sounded exhausted when he called, not seeking advice, just unloading frustration, complaining about how everything felt heavier now, how nothing ran smoothly, and I listened, because listening didn't require surrendering my boundaries. And his complaints revealed something important. They'd removed me thinking they were simplifying their lives, but what they'd actually done was remove a stabilizing layer they'd never named, and now they were dealing directly with pressures that had previously been diffused. The illusion of peace began to crack under the weight of reality. Not because I wanted it to, but because systems exposed to stress reveal their weakest assumptions. His wife reacted by tightening control further, scheduling, planning, managing everything meticulously, and that only increased tension, because rigidity doesn't create calm, it creates brittleness. And brittle systems break under pressure. Not loudly at first, but internally, with resentment and fatigue. I noticed changes in how my son spoke to me too, less accusatory, more uncertain, asking hypothetical questions, testing reactions, as if trying to assess whether I might step back into a role he'd prematurely discarded. And if you're listening right now, stay, because this is where many stories turn toward reconciliation, but this one didn't, because reconciliation requires recognition, and recognition was still absent. He never acknowledged the harm of excluding me, never owned the misuse of concern, never apologized for involving systems without consent, and without that, any return would have meant resuming a role defined by convenience, not respect. I declined that quietly, consistently, and the distance held. Not cold, not cruel, just firm, and that firmness changed the balance more than any confrontation could have. The people around them noticed the shift too, not in dramatic ways, but in the subtle recalibration of trust. Fewer assumptions made in my son's favor, more questions asked before agreement, and that change unsettled him, because authority that has to be defended is already weakened. And if you're listening right now, understand this. People often believe they lose things because someone took them away, but more often, they lose them because they revealed something about themselves that others can't unsee. My son had revealed that when comfort conflicted with accountability, he chose comfort, even if it meant overriding someone else's autonomy. And once that's known, it doesn't stay contained within a family. It travels, quietly, through relationships, through professional circles, through social spaces, and it reshapes how people respond. I didn't celebrate this shift. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt resolved. Because the outcome wasn't punishment, it was alignment. The world responding accurately to information it hadn't had before. And as the weeks passed, it became clear that what my son had lost wasn't my presence, it was the assumption of unquestioned authority. And that loss was something no apology could immediately restore. Because trust, once recalibrated, doesn't snap back. It settles into a new shape, one that reflects what was learned, rather than what was hoped. And if you stay with me, you'll see how this recalibration forced a decision neither of us had planned for. one that would define the rest of our relationship. Not in anger, not in grief, but in clarity. The decision didn't arrive as a reaction to anything new. It came after the dust had settled enough for me to see clearly. And if you're still listening right now, understand this. It wasn't anger that guided me, it was assessment. Once the social recalibration finished, and the strain in their lives became undeniable, I realized something important. Nothing more needed to happen for the pattern to be complete. They had shown me how they made choices under pressure, whose comfort they prioritized, and how easily they reframed control as care. And that information was enough. I met quietly with professionals, not to escalate, not to retaliate, but to structure my life in a way that didn't depend on goodwill or assumptions. Boundaries that had once been emotional became formal. Access that had existed informally was clarified, not announced, just recorded. Decision-making authority was tightened, not out of fear, but out of realism, because when someone has demonstrated a willingness to exclude you for convenience, they've also demonstrated how they'll behave when stakes are higher. I didn't inform my son immediately, not because I was hiding anything, but because explanations weren't necessary anymore. My life didn't require his approval, and when he eventually noticed the changes, when processes took longer, when permissions weren't automatic, when things required formal channels instead of casual requests, his frustration resurfaced, muted this time, controlled, because he understood that pressing harder would only confirm what others had already begun to see. He asked once, carefully, whether I was shutting him out, and I answered honestly, that I was organizing my life in a way that reflected the reality of our relationship, not the version I'd hoped for, and that answer ended the conversation, because there was nothing to argue with. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation. Our contact settled into something minimal and contained. Polite exchanges, necessary updates, no emotional negotiation, and in that space, I felt something unexpected, not loss, but relief, because I was no longer managing someone else's comfort at the expense of my own clarity. I wasn't waiting to be included. I wasn't bracing for the next adjustment. I was simply living, making plans without factoring in whether my presence would be disruptive, and that freedom didn't come from winning. It came from alignment, the alignment between how I was treated and how I structured my life in response. And as I sat one evening in the same quiet house where I'd once wondered whether I was too much, I realized the question had never been whether I belonged. It was whether I was willing to belong to myself, even when others decided I was inconvenient. And that answer, once chosen, didn't require reinforcement. It held on its own. So this is where my story ends. Not with reconciliation, not with an apology that fixes everything, but with a truth that finally stopped bending. My son didn't lose me because I was difficult. He lost access because he decided my presence was optional. And if you're still listening right now, I want you to sit with that for a moment. Because when someone tells you that your existence disrupts their peace, what they're really saying is that your voice makes them uncomfortable, and silence would be easier. I didn't disappear quietly. I simply stopped making myself smaller so others could feel larger. My life didn't collapse without them. It clarified, and the peace they said they needed came at a cost they never calculated. If this story made you angry, or uneasy, or painfully seen, tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and whether you've ever been pushed aside in the name of someone else's peace, because these stories don't stay isolated unless we keep them quiet. And if you believe that no one, not a spouse, not a child, not family, gets to erase you for convenience, share this with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe if you want more real stories about choosing self-respect when silence would have been easier. Thank you for staying, and remember this. Peace that requires your disappearance was never peace at all. It was control dressed up as calm.